Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to take that stack of research you've gathered, all those articles, the notes, maybe some technical papers, and really boil it down into the knowledge you need. And wow, you shared some truly fascinating material this week. It really points to what feels like the biggest convergence yet between, traditional finance, TradFi, and the DeFi world. So our mission today is pretty laser focused. We are diving deep into something huge: the global payments giant, Swift, and specifically their big technology choice. They're betting their future global payments settlement system on an Ethereum Layer-2 solution. It's called Linea. This isn't just like a footnote. It's a massive shift. We need to unpack it.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate this one. This isn't your typical tech upgrade story into swapping out old servers for new ones.
Yeah.
It's foundational because when Swift, which is, let's face it, the absolute backbone of global banking, the trust layer, when they choose to build on open source Web3 tech, that's a massive, massive vote of confidence for the entire decentralized space. It's institutional validation, really moving things past the proof of concept stage and into real infrastructure building.
Absolutely. So our goal for you today is pretty comprehensive. We want to distill the key facts, obviously.
Yeah.
We need to understand the tech behind Linea. It's important. We'll look at the major players, the banks involved, ConsenSys, who built Linea. And then we'll zoom out a bit, look at the new competitive landscape, because this really sets up a strategic battle, doesn't it? Swift Linea versus Ripple XRP.
Definitely. But before we even get into Linea or Ripple, to really get the gravity of this Swift decision, we have to be clear on what Swift actually is. It stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, which is a mouthful.
Yeah, it is.
And, a lot of people think of it just as a messaging system, which it is, partly. It lets banks send secure instructions. But it's more than that. It's fundamentally the circulatory system, the trust layer for global commerce.
It's the standard, right? The global standard for banks talking to each other financially. It's how Bank A in London knows Bank B in Singapore is, serious about sending money.
Precisely. And the sheer scale, it's almost mind-boggling. The sources you sent highlight this. Swift handles something like $150 trillion annually in financial flows and instructions. It's the established, trusted way money moves, even if, moves kind of slowly and expensively sometimes, using those old correspondent banking networks.
Okay, let's unpack this. So $150 trillion flowing through this legacy system. We're talking batch processing, time zones messing things up, limited banking hours.
Fiction.
Exactly. Friction, cost, and maybe most importantly, all that capital just sitting there, locked up, waiting for settlement to actually happen. It's dead money, really.
Yeah.
So that's the established world. And now the big story is that this established world, seeing these problems, seems to have picked its preferred disruptor, its chosen path forward. So let's dive right into that core news. The news that really sent, maybe not just ripples, maybe shockwaves through both TradFi and DeFi. The big announcement. Swift confirmed it. They will be building their new settlement system, the blockchain-based one, directly on Linea. It's not rumor anymore.
And the confirmation wasn't subtle. He came straight from Joe Lubin, who, isn't just the CEO of ConsenSys, the company that actually developed Linea.
Right, the Ethereum connection.
He's also co-founder of Ethereum itself, and he confirmed this partnership at Token 2049, a huge crypto event. The setting itself is significant, announcing this massive institutional move, not in some closed-door bank meeting, but right there in the heart of the Web3 world.
And just to make sure everyone's clear on Linea's background, it's an Ethereum Layer-2, developed by ConsenSys. So we're looking at a direct line, basically, from the absolute peak of global banking infrastructure.
Right.
Straight into the Ethereum ecosystem, the most established, most battle-tested, decentralized network out there.
The immediate implications are, profound. Swift picking Ethereum scaling tech isn't just another pilot project. It feels epical. You have to remember, institutional trust takes years, decades to build. For Swift to say, okay, we trust Ethereum's base security and we trust Linea's execution enough to potentially run a chunk of that $150 trillion through it.
Yeah.
That's the validation. That's the real institutional stamp of approval everyone in Web3 has been sort of waiting for.
And the whole reason for this choice, it comes back to fixing those problems we just talked about, right? Their current system, it's expensive, it's slow. The sources you shared lay out the clear benefits Linea promises. First, actual 247-365 settlement, like no more waiting for banks in different time zones to open.
Huge, and critically much lower operating costs. Why? Well, because you're cutting out layers of intermediaries, those correspondent banks that sit in the middle of cross-border payments. They add costs, they add delay. Linea promises to reduce that, maybe eliminate some entirely. which also means fewer errors, less need for banks to spend time and money fixing mistakes.
Anyone who's dealt with international payments knows that pain, right? Millions just stuck in limbo for days, waiting, getting near instant settlement, finality, 24/7. That's not just efficiency. It unlocks so much capital globally.
Totally. And this big institutional shift, it immediately changes the competitive game. This move puts Linea and really the whole Ethereum scaling scene directly up against Ripple's XRP ledger. Ripple, I mean, they've spent a decade plus specifically targeting banks, saying XRP is the answer for fast, cheap cross-border settlement.
So Swift choosing Linea is like a direct snub to Ripple.
It's certainly a massive vote against Ripple's long-standing narrative, yeah.
Yeah.
It changes the whole dynamic.
Okay, that strategic angle is huge, and we'll definitely come back to that fight. But first, we really need to get under the hood. If $150 trillion is potentially going to flow through this thing, we need to understand the tech Swift is actually betting on. So, okay, Swift picks Linea. But why Linea? Why this specific tech setup over, say, other blockchains? Maybe a private permissioned one or a different layer one. What is Linea, technically speaking? And how does it work for an organization like Swift that has to be, super risk averse?
Okay, so the precise technical term for Linea is a ZK EVM rollup. That term packs in three really powerful ideas, all built on top of Ethereum. Let's break it down. First, rollup. What that means is Linea does most of the heavy lifting, the transaction processing, off the main Ethereum chain. It bundles up thousands of transactions and then posts a compressed summary back to Ethereum. This is how you get massive scaling.
So Ethereum is like the secure foundation, the bedrock, and the rollup is the super fast highway built on top.
That's a good way to think about it. Now, the really clever bit, the Z part, zero-knowledge proofs. This is absolutely fundamental for bank trust. Instead of putting all the raw transaction data back onto the public Ethereum chain, which banks would hate, Linea sends a special cryptographic proof, a ZK proof.
Right.
This proof mathematically guarantees that all those thousands of off-chain transactions were done correctly, securely, but without revealing the actual details of the transactions themselves. Privacy, confidentiality, that's crucial.
But hang on, isn't generating those zero-knowledge proofs, computationally really hard? Doesn't that take a ton of processing power? How does that end up being cheaper if it's so complex?
That's a great question. And it points to how fast the tech, especially the hardware for this stuff, is moving. Yes, generating the proof is intensive, but the huge win is that verifying the proof on the main Ethereum chain is incredibly cheap and fast. You basically shift the hard work to Linea's specialized L2 infrastructure, and you drastically cut down how much data needs to be stored forever on the expensive main chain. That's the magic trick that gives you lower costs and faster finality.
Got it. Okay. And the last part, EVM, Ethereum Virtual Machine compatible. Why does Swift care about that?
EVM compatibility is the strategic linchpin. It means Linea speaks the same language as Ethereum. It can use all the existing Ethereum developers, the tools, the smart contracts, the security audits. I mean, think about it from Swift's perspective. You don't want to build critical infrastructure on some niche proprietary tech stack. You want the standard, the one with the most developers, the most tested security, the biggest ecosystem. Ethereum is that global open source standard.
And what does all that tech translate into for, say, a bank sending thousands of payments a day, in real numbers?
It means huge improvements in speed and cost. The sources specifically mentioned that transaction costs on Linea are roughly 1/15th of what the same transactions would cost directly on Ethereum's mainnet.
Wow.
Think about the scale. If a big bank spends, say, $150 million a year just on Swift messaging fees for certain corridors, moving to Linea could potentially slash, $140 million off that bill, just in direct transaction costs. That's the kind of saving that gets attention in boardrooms. They simply can't ignore that.
That hits one of the biggest hurdles blockchain always had, right? The scaling and the fees. This isn't just for crypto nerds anymore. This is serious infrastructure for serious money. Now let's look at where Linea is now, even before Swift really plugs in, because this isn't some brand new, unproven thing. No, the data shows Linea already has real traction. The total value locked, the TVL, it's basically how much money is already active on the network. It's sitting at around $2.27 billion.
Which is not small change in the L2 world. There are dozens of these Ethereum Layer-2s competing, and that $2.27 billion puts Linea solidly in fourth place overall. So you already had a good foundation, network effects, developers building, user trust. The Swift deal is like pouring rocket fuel onto an already burning fire, not trying to spark a dead one.
So projecting forward, What happens if Swift actually starts using this?
Hmm.
Even if just, say, 1% of that $150 trillion starts flowing through Linea, or if banks start putting tokenized assets or stable coins on there.
Oh, the impact would be colossal. It fundamentally changes the game for Linea. You'd see activity just skyrocket. Transaction fee revenue for the network would surge, and that's a key metric market watchers need to follow. But maybe even more importantly, you'd see an explosion in the ecosystem. Developers would rush in to build compliance tools, analytics, other services around the rails that the world's biggest banks are now using.
Right.
It potentially elevates Linea from just being a strong L2 to becoming the central hub for institutional DeFi globally. That completely changes its strategic value.
Which leads us perfectly into the next section. Because the tech is one thing, but you need the big players to actually use it. The institutional will. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Because we have actual names. Which banks are stepping up, putting their reputation on the line for this pilot? Because this list tells you everything about institutional buy-in. And yeah, we're not talking about small regional banks here. The sources name the big guns involved in the Swift Linea pilot. Bank of America, JP Morgan, and Toronto Dominion, TD Bank.
Just pause and think about those names. Bolfer, Citi, JPM, TD, these are the institutions that basically built the modern financial system, profited from it for decades. Their entire empires were built on those old, closed, private proprietary rails. And now, they're not just writing white papers. They're actively putting resources, people, time into experimenting with open source decentralized tech.
Okay, but let me push back a bit here. Could they just end up, taking the Linea tech but running it privately, like a permissioned version behind their own walls? Does that really count as embracing the decentralized part of DeFi?
That's a fair point, and it's a crucial nuance. Yes, the initial network they use will almost certainly have permissions. Strict KYCML, tailored for banking regs. They can't just plug into a totally open, anonymous public chain day one. But the strategic choice they're making is to build on the Ethereum standard. Using cryptography derived from an open source world, that's a huge psychological shift towards interoperability, towards transparency. That just wouldn't have happened 5 years ago.
Yeah.
They're validating the Web3 tools, even if the first application is in a slightly walled garden.
It feels like an existential shift, though. It proves the big players aren't seeing blockchain as just some weird niche threat anymore. They see it as a necessary upgrade for their core business cross-border settlement.
Exactly. This level of deep institutional involvement with these specific banks, it's the clearest, most solid bridge we've seen yet between TradFi and DeFi. This isn't some side project in an innovation lab anymore. This feels like core business planning.
And it's important to remember this big Swift move, it didn't come out of nowhere, right? We should look at the supporting evidence, the other things happening that show this is part of a bigger trend.
Absolutely right. Swift themselves have been working towards this for years. We know they ran those big CBDC sandbox tests back in 2022, 2023, testing how distributed ledgers could handle central bank digital currencies. So the Linea choice feels like the practical next step, applying what they learned.
And it's not just Swift. The appetite is broader. We've seen both Visa and MasterCard, the other huge payment networks, running pilots with stablecoins on various blockchains, basically kicking the tires on moving regulated digital dollars over decentralized rails.
It points to this competitive pressure, doesn't it? Driven partly by customers, but mostly by the hunt for efficiency. If one big bank group or payment network figures out how to cut cross-border costs by, say, 90% and speed things up dramatically,
Everyone else has to follow.
everyone has to follow. Or they risk becoming obsolete pretty quickly. The pressure is immense.
A good comparison might be Coinbase's Base L2 launch, right? Another big corporate-backed layer 2. And Base showed that when a trusted, regulated entity puts its weight behind an L2,
It can grow incredibly fast.
exactly, huge TVL, developer attention, user adoption almost overnight. Swift is now essentially doing the same thing, lending its massive global credibility, the trust associated with $150 trillion to Linea.
The convergence is definitely happening, and it's speeding up. Which brings us to the fallout. What does this mean for the projects already playing in this space? We have to talk about the ripple effect, so to speak.
All right, section 4, the new competitive landscape. And yeah, the gloves definitely seem to be off now. For years, if you talked about crypto, for banks, for cross-border payments, one name always came up: Ripple.
Without a doubt, Ripple explicitly built the XRP ledger, and their whole strategy around being the solution for banks. Fast, cheap settlement using XRP as a bridge currency. That was their entire pitch to institutions globally.
So now, Swift, the system Ripple, arguably wanted to replace or integrate with PIC's Ethereum tech instead. What's the immediate fallout for Ripple and XRP? This feels like more than just losing a potential customer. It feels like it undermines their whole reason for being almost.
It's a huge challenge, no question. The direct result is that the Ethereum ecosystem, especially Linea, might just start sucking up all the oxygen, the liquidity, the developer attention, the institutional resources. If Bank of America and JP Morgan are building on Linea, where are third-party developers going to focus their efforts? It redirects the flow of innovation and investment.
And the sources mentioned this isn't just about tech specs, it's a narrative war.
Which is so important in the crypto space, as you know. Narrative often drives price and adoption way more than the underlying tech sometimes. If the story shifts from XRP is the future for banks to Ethereum L2s are the validated future for banks, well, that has real consequences for market sentiment, for investment, and ultimately for the long-term prospects of both ecosystems.
That strategic context is key. But we can't talk about this competition without bringing up the regulatory side of things, that big cloud that's been hanging over Ripple.
Yeah, that's the unavoidable backdrop here. Ripple's been tangled up in that high-profile lawsuit with the SEC in the U.S. for years now. And while there have been rulings, that fundamental uncertainty about XRP's legal status, is it a security, has definitely made big, cautious, regulated institutions like global banks very hesitant.
So even if XRP had certain advantages on paper, maybe speed or cost in specific scenarios, the regulatory risk was just too high for Swift and its member banks. They couldn't build their future on something still facing that level of legal challenge.
That seems to be a major factor, yes. By choosing an Ethereum-based solution, particularly one from ConsenSys, which has strong institutional ties and has navigated the regulatory environment carefully, Swift is opting for a path with arguably less regulatory baggage, or at least more manageable risk. That perceived safety, that risk mitigation, might be the critical factor that led an L2 like Linea leapfrog, a long-term contender like XRP in the institutional race.
Okay, we've focused a lot on the plumbing, the transactions, the settlement, but Joe Lubin at ConsenSys seems to have a much bigger vision for Linea, something that goes way beyond just bank payments.
Yeah, let's talk about that broader idea. He described Linea not just as, faster, cheaper payments, but as a potential foundation for a user-generated civilization. That's a pretty grand concept. Sounds like more than just finance. It absolutely reframes the whole thing.
Yeah.
He's envisioning Linea not just as a closed system for banks, but as this scalable base infrastructure that could support all sorts of things. New forms of governance, DAOs, decentralized organizations, cultural applications. It pushes the conversation way past B2B payments into things like digital identity, content creation, data ownership.
So the idea is if Linea becomes the trusted settlement layer for trillions in bank money, that same proven, secure infrastructure could then be used by everyone else for culture, for social networks, for DAOs, for gaming, whatever.
That seems to be the long-term play. Imagine the level of trust and proven stability. If the world's most conservative institutions are settling $150 trillion on this tech, think what that signals for smaller apps or individual users building right alongside them. It's like the ultimate stamp of approval for the whole ecosystem built on Linea.
It's a powerful vision, but okay, we have to stay realistic. Even with Swift's backing, this isn't a guaranteed slam dunk. There are definitely risks, challenges, friction points that could slow this whole thing down.
Right. This raises an important question. What are the friction points? What could go wrong? Well, the first, and maybe the biggest, is regulation. Even if Linea itself avoids some crypto-specific issues, Swift operates globally. They have to navigate an incredibly complex web of compliance rules in hundreds of countries.
Like sanction screening, anti-money laundering.
Exactly. Things like the FTF travel rule, data privacy laws. Making a decentralized system comply perfectly with all of that, everywhere, all the time, that's a monumental task. It's not just tech. It's a massive legal and operational challenge.
And then there's the tech itself. ZK EVM rollups are powerful, but they're still pretty new in the grand scheme of things, especially for something as critical as global finance.
Correct. Linea has to prove it can handle the sheer scale Swift demands. Reliably, securely. 247. We're talking potentially hundreds of millions of transactions a day from hundreds of banks nonstop for years. That kind of stress testing. Well, it hasn't really happened yet for any L2 at that level. It's the ultimate trial by fire for ZK rollups.
And there's also the question of the sequencer, right? The part of the rollup that actually orders and submits the transactions. If that stays too centralized for control or compliance reasons, doesn't that create its own risks? A single point of failure, maybe?
That's a definite concern. centralization risk. And finally, there's just the nature of banks themselves. They move slowly, they're cautious. They might keep Linea in the pilot phase for a long time, running it alongside the old systems just in case. The commitment is there, but the speed of full adoption might be much slower than people expect. They won't just rip out the old Swift overnight.
Okay, so let's bring it all together. For you listening in, tracking this story, what are the practical things you should be watching? What are the key indicators that show how this is really playing out?
Okay, 4 main things to keep a close eye on. First, token impact. Watch ETH, obviously, but also other L2 tokens, especially anything connected to ConsenSys. They could see indirect benefits from this institutional nod. And conversely, keep a very close eye on Ripple, XRP. If Linea starts showing real volume, XRP could face serious headwinds.
Second, Linea's own metrics. You need the hard data. Track Linea's TVL sites like L2Beat make this easy, but also watch its transaction counts and, crucially, the fees being generated. That tells you if actual real value is moving onto the network or if it's still mostly testing.
Third, bank activity. Look for official announcements. Which banks are joining the pilot? Are they expanding beyond basic payments? Are they talking about tokenizing assets, using it for trade finance? The types of use cases will signal how deep the commitment is becoming.
And lastly,
comparative data. You need to see if the promise holds up. Watch how XRP and ETH trade around future Swift Linea news that shows market sentiment, and critically compare real-world cross-border payment costs. The World Bank tracks this against the costs on Linea. If Linea consistently delivers that massive cost saving at scale, that's the proof. That's when you know the experiment has become the new reality.
So, to wrap up this deep dive, the big takeaway seems pretty clear. A $150 trillion network, the absolute bedrock of global finance, is making a strategic bet on Ethereum scaling technology. It's more than just tech, it's a fundamental strategy shift that could literally rewrite the architecture of global banking.
Yeah, it really underscores how that bridge between TradFi and DeFi is being built right now. It takes the whole discussion out of the realm of theory and potential and puts it right into the heart of institutional implementation. That line between the old financial world and the decentralized future, it just got seriously blurred.
So we'll leave you with a final question to think about based on all this material you shared. Does Swift picking Linea mean Ethereum is now effectively the default settlement layer for global finance? Or is this just chapter 1 of a very long, very cautious experiment that could still hit major roadblocks? Something to definitely mull over. Thanks again for sharing such a rich set of sources for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.